Kalen felt the dust of terminus in his teeth before he even saw the ramshackle buildings. It was a taste of grit and desperation, a fine powder kicked up by the relentless wind that scoured the plains at the foot of his mountains. He hated the town. He hated the flatness, the lack of trees, the way the sun beat down without mercy. But once every season, the salt and flour ran low, and the solitude of his peaks became a hungry loneliness that only supplies could cure. He kept his head down, the brim of his hat low, his presence a heavy shadow moving through the thin crowd gathered by the rail platform. He was not there for the spectacle, but it was unavoidable. The railroad company was clearing its books. The human-shaped debts were being called in. A man with a slick back hair and a suit too fine for the dust stood on a crate, his voice a grating whine that carried over the murmurs of the assembled townsfolk. His name was Silas Thorne, an agent of progress and profit, and he was selling people. Not in name, of course. He was selling indenture contracts, the passage west paid for with years of servitude. It was a legal distinction that made no difference to the soul standing on the auction block. Kalen's jaw was a knot of old granite. He had seen the others sold. A gaunt farmer who had lost his crop, a young couple whose dreams had turned to dust on the trail. Each transaction was a small death, a chipping away at something Kalen rarely thought about anymore, hope. He was turning to leave, his business at the general store still undone, when Thorne gestured to the last figure. A girl. She was young, barely a woman, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that were fixed on the splintered planks beneath her feet. And finally, Thorne announced, his tone thick with condescending pity, "We have this one." Imani, he let the name hang in the air, a piece of meat for the dogs. Her parents, regrettably, succumbed to fever on the journey. A tragedy, of course. But the company's ledger is unsentimental. He circled her, his gaze a physical thing, palpating and appraising. The debt remains. $30 for her passage. A silence fell over the crowd. Not a respectful silence, but a heavy, awkward one. The girl did not move. She seemed to be trying to shrink into herself, to make her frame smaller, an impossible task. She was not slight or waifish like the others. She was sturdily built, her shoulders broad, her body full and rounded under the simple, worn dress. In a world where leanness was often a sign of starvation, her form should have spoken of health, but here, under Thorne's sneering gaze, it was made into a defect. $30, Thorne repeated, a cruel smile playing on his lips. A strong back for farm work, or other duties. A few men in the crowd shuffled their feet. Surely someone has need of a worker? Perhaps the price is the issue. Let us say 25. He paused, scanning the blank faces. His smile tightened. He was a showman losing his audience. His gaze fell upon the girl again, and his cruelty, needing an outlet, sharpened to a razor's edge. Perhaps you are wondering about the investment. Is she worth the coin? She is substantial. You would certainly be getting your money's worth in sheer volume. A low, ugly titter ran through a small part of the crowd. The girl, Imani, flinched as if struck. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, twisted into the fabric of her dress. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Her lips moved, and a whisper, so quiet it was almost lost to the wind, reached Kalen's ears. It was a sound of utter defeat, a final, heartbreaking surrender. "No one will buy me," she breathed. "Because I'm fat." The words did not just enter Kalen's ears. They broke through a wall of ice that had encased his heart for 5 long years. He saw not the dusty platform, but a small, fire-lit cabin. He smelled not the grit of terminus, but pine and stew. He heard not the girl's whisper, but his own daughter's laughter. Ilara. Small, bright, taken by a fever the doctors had no name for. Then he saw his wife, Lila, her face a mask of grief before she, too, faded from the world, leaving him in a silence as vast and cold as the winter peaks. That whisper. It was the sound of a spirit being broken, and it was a sound he had sworn he would never stand by and hear again. His feet moved before his mind had caught up. He pushed through the onlookers, who parted as if before a force of nature. His buckskin clothes, his unkempt beard, his sheer size, they marked him as a man apart, a creature of the mountains who did not belong in the dirt of this town. He stopped before the crate, his shadow falling over both Imani and the sneering railroad agent. Silas Thorne looked up, momentarily startled. He saw a giant of a man, ice the color of a stormy sky, holding a fury that seemed ancient and personal. He recomposed himself, forcing a greasy smile. "Ah. A man of the mountains. Have you come to bid? Do not be shy. We can start the bidding at, say, $20 for this specimen." Kalen's gaze did not waver from Thorne's. It was flat, cold, and absolute. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with money. This was something older. Something primal. He did not acknowledge the insult or the price. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. The crowd held its breath. "I will not bid," Kalen said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. It was the first time he had spoken more than 2 words to anyone but himself in months, and the sound felt foreign in his own throat. He pulled out a small, heavy stack of gold coins. They gleamed with a warmth that was alien in this bleached landscape. He looked at Thorne, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt entered his eyes. It was a cold, hard clarity. "I will pay $90. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $90. It was a fortune. It was 3 times the original outrageous price. It was enough to buy a small plot of land, a team of horses. It was an impossible sum for an indenture contract. Thorne's jaw went slack. Greed warred with confusion in his beady eyes, and greed won an easy victory. The mockery vanished from his face, replaced by an avaricious gleam. 90, he stammered, his eyes glued to the gold. Sold. For $90, to the gentleman. He practically snatched the coins from Kalen's outstretched hand, his fingers scurrying like rats. He quickly scribbled a signature on the indenture paper, a flimsy document that was now worth more than the man who had written it. He thrust it at Kalen. Kalen took the paper. He did not look at it. He folded it once and tucked it inside his shirt. His gaze then moved, for the first time, to the girl. Imani was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter bewilderment. She was trembling, a leaf in a storm. She did not understand what had just happened. She had been bought. By a mountain. By a wild man who had paid a king's ransom for her. What did he want? What would he do to her? Her fear was a palpable thing, a scent in the air. Kalen saw the terror in her eyes, and a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar went through him. It was not pity. It was responsibility. A heavy, unasked-for weight that settled on his shoulders as surely as his winter cloak. He had not thought this far. He had only acted. Now, he had to finish it. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod. "You come with me," he said. The words were not a command, but a statement of fact. A new line had been drawn in the dust of Terminus. She was his to protect. And he, a man who had nothing, was hers. Imani's world had shrunk to the back of the mountain man. He walked with a long, ground-eating stride, and she had to half-jog to keep up. The curious, pitying stares of the townspeople fell away, replaced by the vast, indifferent silence of the high country. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach. Who was this man? Why had he done this? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, but she dared not speak them. Silence was safety. It had been her only shield for months. He did not speak to her. Not a single word passed his lips as they left the town behind and began the steady climb into the foothills. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The scent of dust was replaced by the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. For a man of his size, he moved with a startling quietness, his feet finding sure purchase on the rocky trail. Imani, unused to such exertion, felt her lungs burn and her legs ache. Several times she stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. Each time, he stopped, turning his head just enough to ensure she was on her feet before continuing. He never offered a hand. He never spoke a word of encouragement. He just waited. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple when they finally arrived. The cabin was nestled in a small, sheltered clearing, backed by a sheer cliff of grey stone. It was smaller than she expected, built of thick, dark logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin tendril of smoke curled lazily into the twilight. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. A place of exile. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the single room. It was starkly furnished. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner covered with thick furs, and shelves holding a few pots and provisions. It was meticulously clean. There was no clutter, no sign of a life lived with others. It was the den of a solitary creature. Kalen gestured towards a pile of furs and blankets in the corner opposite his own bed. There, he grunted. It was the first word he'd spoken since the auction. He then moved to the hearth, ladling a thick, savory-smelling stew into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the table, along with a chunk of dark bread. He did not invite her to eat. He simply put the food down and turned back to the fire, his broad back a wall between them. Imani hesitated, her stomach rumbling in betrayal of her fear. She watched him for a long moment. He seemed to be staring into the flames, lost in a world she could not see. Slowly, cautiously, she crept to the table and sat down. The stew was hot, rich with meat and root vegetables. It was the most satisfying meal she had eaten in months. The simple, unconditional offering of food was a kindness more profound than any she had known for a very long time. It did not erase her fear, but it banked its flames, leaving embers of weary gratitude in their place. She ate until the bowl was empty, then curled up in the pile of furs he had indicated, pulling a thick wool blanket up to her chin. She did not expect to sleep, but exhaustion claimed her quickly. Her last waking thought was of the silent man staring into the fire, a guardian or a jailer, she did not yet know which. From his place by the fire, Kalen listened to the soft rhythm of her breathing. He had not sat at this table with another person since Lila. The simple act of sharing a meal, even in silence, had felt momentous, a violation of the sterile grief he had so carefully cultivated. He had bought her. The thought was absurd. He had no use for an indentured servant. He wanted only to be left alone. But the memory of that cruel voice, that broken whisper, had dredged up a part of him he thought was long dead. The protector. The husband. The father. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine, unspoken and unnegotiated, began to form. Kalen would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and slipped out into the cold morning air to hunt or chop wood. Imani would wake to the warmth of the cabin, and she would tidy the small space, fetch water from the icy stream, and knead the dough for their daily bread. He was the provider, she the keeper of the hearth. It was a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. He never demanded anything of her. Her chores were tasks she took upon herself, a silent offering of gratitude, a way to earn the food she ate and the roof over her head. She found a strange comfort in the work. It was purposeful. Honest. After months of being treated as a burden, a piece of unwanted luggage, the simple dignity of labor felt like a balm to her wounded spirit. One afternoon, while Kalen was out checking his trap lines, Imani was sweeping the floor near his cot. Tucked beneath the furs, almost hidden, was a small object. A child's doll, carved from wood, its form smoothed by years of handling. It wore a tiny, faded dress made from a scrap of calico. Imani picked it up gently. It was a thing of simple, profound love. She could almost feel the phantom touch of the small hands that had once cherished it. She placed it back carefully, a wave of sadness washing over her, not for herself, but for the silent, grieving man who inhabited this lonely cabin. She was beginning to understand that his silence was not anger, but a fortress built around an immeasurable loss. When Kalen returned that evening, he found the cabin tidy as always, with a pot of soup simmering over the fire. As he sat down to eat, he noticed something on the small pallet of furs where Imani slept. It was a bird. A small, intricately carved wooden wren, its head cocked as if listening. He froze, the spoon halfway to his lips. He had carved it years ago, a gift for Ilara on her 5th birthday. He had thought it long lost, tucked away in a box of memories too painful to open. He looked at Imani. She was watching him, her dark eyes wide and uncertain. She had found it. And instead of keeping it, she had placed it where he would see it. It was not a question. It was a statement. I see your pain. Kalen felt the fortress wall crack. Just a hairline fracture, but it was enough for a sliver of light to get in. He picked up the small wren, his calloused thumb stroking the smooth wood. He had not allowed himself to touch any of Ilara's things since the burying. It hurt. It was a clean, sharp pain, a piercing of the numb scar tissue around his heart. But it was also a relief. To feel something again. Even if it was grief. He looked across the small cabin at the girl, this stranger he had brought into the heart of his solitude. He gave a single, slow nod. Acknowledgement. Gratitude. And for the first time, a fragile, tentative bridge of understanding was built between them in the flickering firelight. Meanwhile, in the dusty railroad office in Terminus, Silas Thorne was discovering the true value of his transaction. He was reviewing a new territorial survey map against the company's land acquisition ledgers, a tedious but necessary part of his job. His mind was still buzzing with the $90. It was a foolish, glorious windfall. He chuckled to himself, thinking of the mountain man's intensity. All that for a sullen, oversized girl. Then his eyes caught a name in the ledger, Abiku. He cross-referenced it with the indenture file for the girl, Imani. Her parents. Abiku and his wife, Amora. Thorne traced the name in the ledger to a corresponding plot number on the survey map. His self-satisfied smirk froze on his face. Plot 734. A small, 5-acre parcel of land, dismissed by the initial surveyors as worthless scrub. But the new map told a different story. The planned route for the new main rail spur, the one that would connect Terminus to the silver mines in the north, cut directly through the middle of Plot 734. What was once scrubland was now a critical right-of-way. The company would have to buy it. And they would pay dearly. He scrambled through the paperwork, his heart beginning to pound. The indenture contract he had sold was based on a lie. He told the girl her parents died in debt to the railroad for passage. The truth, buried in the fine print of a corporate transit manifest, was that their passage was paid for in land rights, a temporary concession of their property until they could build and work it. But they had died before they could, leaving their sole heir, Imani, as the legal owner. The indenture was a fraudulent document he'd cooked up himself, a quick way to dispose of the girl and absorb the abandoned land into the company's assets. He had assumed she was worthless, and in doing so, had sold the deed to a small fortune for $90. A cold fury washed over him. He had been cheated. By his own arrogance. That hulking, silent brute had not just bought a girl, he had stumbled into a gold mine. Thorne slammed his fist on the desk. This would not stand. The paper he had signed was a bill of sale for an indenture, not a land title. He could claim the contract was invalid, that the girl was essential railroad property misrepresented at the time of sale. He would get her back. He would get that land. He hired a grim-faced man named Calloway, a local enforcer whose loyalty was easily bought, and the two of them rode out of Terminus, heading for the high peaks, dust rising behind them like an angry promise. The sharp crack of a horse's shod hoof on stone alerted Kalen. He was splitting logs behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. He paused, axe in hand, and listened. 2 horses, moving with purpose up his trail. No one came up this high. He strode to the front of the cabin, his eyes narrowed. He saw them then, 2 riders breaking through the tree line. The slick suit of Silas Thorne was unmistakable, even from a distance. Imani, who had been inside, came to the doorway, her face pale. She recognized the man who had sold her, and the sight of him struck a fresh wave of fear into her. Kaelin moved to stand slightly in front of her, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and buckskin. Thorn and Calloway reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, Calloway's hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "Mountain Man," Thorn called out, his voice thin and sharp in the clean air. "We have business." "Our business is concluded," Kaelin rumbled, not moving a muscle. "A mistake was made," Thorn said, dismounting. He tried to project an air of authority, but it was frayed by the unease of being in Kaelin's territory. "There was a clerical error. The girl's contract is invalid. I'm here to rectify the situation. The $90 will be returned, of course. She must come back with me." Kaelin's gaze was like chips of ice. "The paper is mine. The girl is free." "She is not free," Thorn snapped, his composure breaking. "She is the property of the Transcontinental Railroad Company until her debt is paid. That paper you hold is meaningless. I am the law here." "You are a liar," Kaelin said, the words flat and heavy. "And you are not the law on this mountain." He took a half step forward. It was a small movement, but laden with unspoken menace. Calloway's hand tightened on his pistol, but his eyes darted nervously towards the dense forest that surrounded them. He knew, as Thorn did not, that they were at a severe disadvantage here. This was Kaelin's world. He could disappear into the trees and be on them from a dozen different angles before they could even draw their weapons. Thorn saw the resolve in Kaelin's face and the fear in his own man's eyes. He forced a sneer. "You are making a grave mistake. You cannot keep her. I will be back. And I will bring the sheriff. We will see what your mountain law is worth against a federal warrant." He climbed back onto his horse, his movements jerky and angry. "This is not over." They wheeled their horses around and galloped back down the trail, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Kaelin stood for a long time, watching them go. He knew Thorn was not making an idle threat. A warrant. The sheriff. He had lived outside the law for so long, he had almost forgotten its reach. He could not fight the whole world from his mountain. Not if he wanted to protect the girl. He turned and looked at Imani. Her fear was still there, but it was mingled with something else now, a flicker of awe. No one had ever stood up for her like that. "He will be back," Kaelin stated, his mind already working. "I have to go to the town." He looked at her, his expression grim. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone." He was leaving her, but there was a promise in his eyes this time. He would return. He packed a small satchel with dried meat and a water skin, took his rifle from its pegs on the wall, and without another word, melted into the forest, his long strides carrying him back toward the dusty, dangerous world he had tried so hard to leave behind. He had to find an ally. He had to find the truth before Thorn could bury it under a mountain of legal lies. Kaelin moved through the streets of Terminus like a ghost of a different era. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their gazes a mixture of fear and curiosity. Whispers followed him. The mountain man who bought the black girl. Thorn had been busy, planting his seeds of poison. Kaelin ignored them. He had one destination, the general store. It was run by a woman named Elspeth, a widow whose husband had been one of the first surveyors in this territory. She was as much a fixture of the town as the railroad itself, a woman of quiet strength and unassailable integrity. If there was a conscience in Terminus, it resided within her. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival. Elspeth was behind the counter, weighing out a sack of flour. She was a woman in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. She looked up at Kaelin, her expression neutral. "Kaelin," she said, her voice calm. "It is early for you to need supplies again." "I am not here for supplies," he said, his voice low. He walked to the counter. "I need help." Elspeth stopped her work and gave him her full attention. The fact that Kaelin, a man who was the very definition of self-sufficiency, was asking for help was significant. She listened without interruption as he told her everything, his words clipped and precise. He spoke of the auction, of Thorn's cruelty, of the girl, Imani. He told her of Thorn's visit to the mountain and his threat to return with the sheriff. When he finished, Elspeth was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Silas Thorn, she said, her voice laced with distaste. That man is a blight. He preys on the desperate. You are not the first to be tangled in his web, Kaelin, but you are the first with the grit to fight back. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. Thorn has been acquiring land for the railroad through questionable means. Indentures, foreclosures, debts that appear from nowhere. People have lost everything. But they are poor and afraid. They have no one to speak for them. He said my paper was meaningless, Kaelin said. He wants her back. If he wants her back this badly, then she is worth more than you paid for her, Elspeth reasoned. There must be something in the company records. A ledger, a deed. Something that proves her claim and his fraud. She tapped a finger on the counter. The main railroad office. The records will be there. But Thorn keeps them under lock and key. I need to bring Imani to town, Kaelin realized. For her safety. And for her to speak. That is a risk, Elspeth warned. Thorn has painted you as a kidnapper, a savage who has run off with company property. The town is wary. But, she added, a spark of defiance in her eyes, it is a risk we must take. Truth needs a voice. Bring her here. She can stay with me. My home is safe. Kaelin nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. He had an ally. He turned to leave. Elspeth, he said, pausing at the door. Thank you, she simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just agreed to wage together. The journey back up the mountain was faster. Kaelin's steps were fueled by a new urgency. When he reached the cabin, he found the door barred, just as he had instructed. He called out her name, and after a moment's hesitation, he heard the heavy bar being lifted. Imani stood in the doorway, her face etched with relief. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The unspoken barrier between them had been weakened by the shared threat. As the fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls, Imani's gaze fell upon the small wooden wren Kaelin had placed on the mantelpiece. Who was she? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin went still. He stared into the flames, his big hands clenched on his knees. The silence stretched, and Imani thought he would not answer. But then he spoke, his voice thick with unshed grief. Ilara, he said. My daughter. He did not look at her. There was a fever. It took her. And her mother, Lila. He fell silent again, the names hanging in the air like ghosts. It was more than he had said about his past to anyone. It was a shard of his broken heart, offered in the dim light of the cabin. Imani felt her own sorrow well up in response. My parents too, she said softly. A fever, on the trail. They had a small farm, before. Back east. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes shining with tears. They wanted a new start. They used to talk about the land they would own here. A place where no one could tell them what to do. Where they could be free. She took a shaky breath. That is what Mr. Thorn stole. Not just a piece of dirt. He stole their dream. In that moment, they were no longer a mountain man and a purchased girl. They were two survivors, two souls bonded by a shared landscape of loss. He saw his own grief mirrored in her eyes, and she saw in his silence not a rejection, but a profound, shared understanding. He had lost his family to fate. She had lost hers to sickness and greed. But here, in this remote cabin, they were the last remnants of those families. And they were all each other had left. The next morning, they left for Terminus together. As they walked down the mountain, Kaelin saw the way Imani's eyes lingered on the trees, the rocks, the vast open sky. She was not just a victim anymore. She was a girl who had a dream to fight for. And he would fight for it with her. Their arrival in town caused a stir. Heads turned. People stopped and stared. Kaelin, the reclusive mountain man, walking side by side with the black girl he had bought at auction. Thorn's poison had done its work. Suspicion hung in the air, thick and cloying. They saw a brute and his possession, a savage and his prize. Kalen felt the stares like physical blows, not for himself, he was used to being an outcast, but for Imani. He saw her flinch, her shoulders hunching as she tried to make herself smaller. He instinctively moved a little closer to her, his presence a shield against the hostile eyes. Elspeth was waiting for them. She met them at the entrance to her store, her face a calm and welcoming beacon in a sea of distrust. "Come inside," she said, her voice carrying a clear note of authority that silenced the nearest murmurs. She led them not into the store, but through a side door and up a narrow flight of stairs to the small, clean apartment where she lived. "You will be safe here," she assured them, guiding Imani to a simple but comfortable room. "No one will bother you." Over the next 2 days, Elspeth became their general. While Kalen stood guard, a silent and imposing sentinel, Elspeth moved through the town, a quiet force of reason and persuasion. She started with Jedediah, the blacksmith. He was a good man, but a cautious one. Elspeth reminded him of his own cousin, who had lost his wagon and tools to a sudden, inexplicable debt held by the railroad. "Thorn is a snake, Jedediah," she said plainly over a cup of coffee in his smithy. "And he will keep biting until someone has the courage to chop off his head. This girl, Imani, she has courage. She just needs a chance." Jedediah, a man who respected hard work and fairness above all, listened, his hammer resting on the anvil. The story resonated with the injustice he had long felt simmering in the town. Elspeth also spoke to the baker, whose wife had been a friend of Imani's mother on the trail. She recounted the family's hopes, their dreams of a small farm, painting a picture not of railroad property, but of a grieving daughter whose inheritance was being stolen. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide of public opinion began to shift. It was no longer a simple story of a wild man and a bought girl. It became a story of a community's own simmering grievances finding a focal point. It was about one of their own, a child of the trail, being wronged by the faceless power of the railroad that controlled their lives. Meanwhile, in the small room above the store, a different kind of alliance was being forged. Kalen, feeling useless and caged within the 4 walls, began to whittle. He sat by the window, his large knife moving with surprising delicacy over a piece of pine wood. He carved another bird, this one a hawk, its wings outstretched as if about to take flight. He did not say who it was for, but when he was finished, he left it on the small table beside Imani's bed. Imani found it that evening. She picked it up, feeling the smooth, powerful lines of the carving. It was not a doll. It was not a toy. It was a promise. It was a symbol of the strength she was beginning to feel inside herself. She looked over at Kalen, who was staring out the window, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He was more than a protector. He was her friend. He was teaching her, without words, that she did not have to be small to be safe. She could be powerful. She could soar. The next day, when Elspeth told them that Thorn had forced the sheriff to call a public hearing, Imani did not shrink. She stood up taller, the wooden hawk clutched in her hand. The town hall was packed. Every chair was filled, and people stood 3 deep along the back and side walls. The air was thick with anticipation and tension. At the front of the room, behind a long wooden table, sat Sheriff Brody. He was a man caught in the middle, his face a grim mask of duty. On one side of the room sat Silas Thorne, looking smug and confident, a sheaf of official-looking documents laid out neatly before him. On the other side sat Kalen and Imani, with Elspeth beside them. Kalen was a figure of stone, his face unreadable. Imani was terrified, but she sat straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap around a small, hard object. Sheriff Brody banged his gavel. "This hearing is now in session," he announced, his voice booming in the crowded room. "Mr. Thorne, you may present your case." Thorne stood, all preening self-importance. "Thank you, Sheriff. The matter is simple. The Transcontinental Railroad Company is the legal guardian of the girl, Imani, holder of her indenture contract until such time as her family's debt of passage is paid. This man," he pointed a dramatic finger at Kalen, "under the guise of a sale, abducted her. The sale was fraudulent, as I was not authorized to dispense of company assets in that manner. The girl is property of the railroad. I have the legal documents right here to prove it." He slapped the papers on the table with a flourish. "I demand her immediate return to my custody." Sheriff Brody looked at the papers, then over at Kalen. "Mr. Kalen?" "Your response." Kalen stood slowly. His size alone seemed to suck the air out of the room. He looked not at the sheriff, but directly at Thorne. "He lies," Kalen said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Then he sat down. The two words, delivered with such absolute conviction, were more powerful than Thorne's entire speech. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne laughed, a high, condescending sound. "He lies? Is that the extent of your legal argument, mountain man? Grunting in the presence of civilized men?" He turned to the sheriff. "As you can see, he has no case. He is a savage who understands nothing of the law." Sheriff Brody looked troubled. The law, as Thorne presented it, seemed clear. "Imoni," the sheriff said, his voice gentle. "Do you have anything to say?" All eyes turned to her. This was the moment. She felt a wave of dizziness, the faces in the crowd blurring into a single, judgmental stare. She felt Kalen's presence beside her, solid and steady as a rock. She felt the smooth, carved wood of the hawk in her hand. She thought of her mother and father. She thought of their dream. She took a deep breath and stood up. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. "My name is Imoni Abiku." She cleared her throat and started again, a little stronger this time. "My name is Imoni Abiku. My parents were Amora and Abiku. We did not travel here in debt." She looked directly at Thorne, and the fear in her eyes began to burn away, replaced by a cold, clear fire. "Mr. Thorne told us our land would pay for our passage. He told us it was an advance. He gave my father papers to sign." "Lies and fantasy!" Thorne shouted. "The girl is confused. Grieving." "I am not confused," Imoni said, her voice rising now, filling the hall. It was a voice no one in that room had ever heard, clear and strong and ringing with truth. "You told my father his land was worthless scrub, but that the railroad would take it as a gesture of charity. But you knew. You knew the new spur was coming. You wanted our land for yourself." She turned from Thorne and addressed the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the blacksmith, the baker, the other families who had been broken by the railroad. "He looks at people and sees only what they are worth in dollars. He looked at me and saw nothing but a fat girl he couldn't sell. He didn't see a daughter. He didn't see a person. He saw a problem to be discarded." Just as Thorne was about to explode in a torrent of angry denials, the main doors of the town hall swung open. Elspeth stood there, and beside her was a pale, nervous-looking young clerk from the railroad office. In his hands, he held a large, leather-bound ledger. "Sheriff," Elspeth said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Perhaps you should examine the company's actual land acquisition ledger. The one Mr. Thorne keeps hidden in his office." The clerk, prodded forward by Elspeth and the formidable glare of Jedediah the blacksmith behind her, walked shakily to the front and placed the ledger on the sheriff's table. Brody opened it. His eye scanned the page, then widened. He compared the entry for plot 734 with the fraudulent indenture Thorne had presented. The truth was there, in black and white. Landowner, Abiku, Amora, and Abiku. Payment for transit, temporary concession of land rights. Imoni Abiku. The crowd erupted. The murmurs became shouts. "Thief! Liar!" The anger that had been simmering in Terminus for months finally boiled over. They saw in Imoni's fight their own struggles, in Thorne's corruption the source of their own hardships. This was not just her victory, it was theirs. Sheriff Brody stood up, his face like thunder. He looked at Thorne, who had gone white as a sheet. "Silas Thorne," he boomed, his voice silencing the room. "I am placing you under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and theft." The fight was over. As the sheriff led a sputtering, defeated Thorn out of the hall, the townsfolk surged forward. But they were not heading for Kaelin. They were surrounding Imani. They touched her arm, they offered words of support, they looked at her with respect and admiration. She had been their voice. She had faced down the dragon, and she had won. In the quiet aftermath, as the crowd dispersed and the evening sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, Kaelin, Imani, and Elspeth stood outside the town hall. The air felt clean again. Imani's land was legally hers. The fraudulent indenture Kaelin had bought for $90 was nothing more than a scrap of paper, a testament to a lie. He held it out and let the wind snatch it from his fingers. He looked at Imani. She was no longer the frightened, defeated girl from the auction platform. She stood tall, her gaze clear and steady. She was free. A landowner. She did not need his protection any longer. An unexpected ache settled in his chest, a feeling of impending loneliness he had not felt since he first retreated to his mountain. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Imani looked out toward the west, where her land lay, unseen. Then she looked back at him, her dark eyes searching his. "The law says the land is mine," she said softly. "But land is just dirt. A home needs people." A small, hopeful smile touched her lips. "I thought, maybe we could build one. Together." Kaelin stared at her. The thought was radical. A home. With someone else. For 5 years, his cabin had been a tomb, a memorial to a life that was over. He had sought solitude as a way to hold on to his grief, to keep it pure and undisturbed. But this girl, this impossible, resilient girl, was not offering to erase his past. She was offering him a future. She was offering to build something new on the foundations of their shared sorrow. He saw a flash of his daughter, Ilara, not pale with sickness, but laughing in the sun. He saw his wife, Lila, not fading away, but smiling at him across a hearth. Hope, an emotion he had thought buried forever, stirred within him, fragile but persistent. He gave a single, decisive nod. It was all the answer she needed. Weeks later, the sound of a hammer echoed across plot 734. It was not the rhythmic, solitary sound of Kaelin's axe, but a new, shared cadence. He was teaching Imani how to frame a wall for a small, sturdy house, the first building to stand on this land. Her swings were clumsy at first, but she learned quickly, her laughter ringing out when a nail bent under her hammer. The sun was warm on their backs, and the mountains, Kaelin's mountains, stood as silent witnesses on the horizon. They were not his refuge from the world anymore. They were just home. A wagon rattled up the new trail, driven by Elspeth, laden with lumber and sacks of flour and coffee, gifts from the people of Terminus. Jedediah the blacksmith had forged them a set of hinges for their door, and the baker's wife had sent a fresh loaf of bread. The people of the town no longer saw a strange mountain man and a purchased girl. They saw a family. A family forged not by blood, but by defiance. A family built not on law or paper, but on a choice made in the dust, a choice for kindness, for justice, and for the simple, profound hope of building a home together.